August 17th, 1884. Grand Street, Lower Manhattan. The summer heat had turned the tenement district into a slow-burning furnace. Laundry lines stretched between buildings like spider silk, and the air carried the smell of coal smoke, rotting fish from the East River docks, and something else. The acrid tang of fear. At 79 Clinton Street, a narrow four-story building with peeling paint and iron-barred windows, the New York Police Department had stationed two plainclothes officers across the cobblestone street. They'd been watching for weeks, watching the endless stream of men entering and leaving at all hours, watching crates being unloaded in the dead of night, watching a woman, heavy-set, middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, orchestrate what investigators would later describe as the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in American history. Her name was Fredericka Mandelbaum, and on this sweltering August morning, the woman they called Marm was about to disappear into legend. Inside that Clinton Street building, beneath the floorboards of what appeared to be a modest dry goods store, lay a warehouse of stolen property valued at more than $1 million, an incomprehensible fortune in 1884, equivalent to roughly $30 million today. Silk fabrics from Brooklyn warehouses, gold watches from Broadway jewelers, bonds stolen from Wall Street offices, entire shipments of imported goods that had vanished from the docks. For 25 years, Fredericka Mandelbaum had built an empire on other people's crimes, and for 25 years, she had remained untouchable. The police knew her name, the district attorneys knew her operation, but no one could prove a thing. Until now. The officers watched as a closed carriage pulled up to the front entrance. They saw Mandelbaum emerge, a woman in her late 50s, wearing an expensive but understated dress, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She carried nothing, said nothing to the driver. Climbed into the carriage with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd planned this moment down to the second. By the time the police realized what was happening, the carriage had already turned onto Grand Street, heading toward the Brooklyn Bridge. By noon, Fredericka Mandelbaum had vanished. She would never return to American soil. The woman who had financed burglaries, trained thieves, corrupted police officers, and turned crime into a business model studied by criminals for generations had slipped through the fingers of justice one final time. But the evidence she left behind would reveal something far more disturbing than a single criminal's escape. It would expose the blueprint of organized crime itself, decades before the mafia, decades before anyone understood that crime could be industrialized. Fredericka Mandelbaum was born Friederike Wendt in 1825 in the Prussian province of Kassel, part of what would later become Germany. She arrived in New York City in 1850, part of the massive wave of German Jewish immigration that transformed the city's demographics and economy in the mid-19th century. She was 25 years old, married to a small-time peddler named Wolf Mandelbaum, and pregnant with the first of her 4 children. They settled in Kleindeutschland, Little Germany, the densely packed immigrant neighborhood on the Lower East Side where German was spoken more commonly than English, and survival required ingenuity, ruthlessness, and an understanding that the law was something negotiated, not obeyed. By the mid-1850s, the Mandelbaums had opened a small haberdashery at 79 Clinton Street. On the surface, it was unremarkable. Fabric, ribbons, sewing supplies, the kind of modest enterprise that sustained thousands of immigrant families. But Fredericka Mandelbaum understood something fundamental about New York's economy that most legitimate business people did not. Theft was a growth industry. The city was expanding at an unprecedented rate. Warehouses lined the waterfronts. Department stores were opening along Broadway. Banks held enormous reserves of cash and bonds. Wealthy families filled their brownstones with imported luxury goods, and protecting all of that property was an understaffed, underpaid, and staggeringly corrupt police force that had been formed only in 1845. The city was a criminal's paradise, but criminals had a problem. What do you do with a stolen diamond necklace when every jeweler in Manhattan knows it's stolen? What do you do with 300 yards of stolen silk when legitimate fabric merchants won't touch it? You needed someone to turn crime into money. You needed a fence. Fredericka Mandelbaum became that person. Court records from her eventual indictment suggest she began her fencing operation sometime around 1854 or 1855, just a few years after arriving in America. Her initial customers were small-time thieves from the neighborhood, pickpockets, burglars, shoplifters. She would buy stolen goods for 20 to 30% of their retail value, then resell them through a network of legitimate-appearing businesses, or ship them to buyers in other cities where their origin couldn't be traced. It was a simple model, but Mandelbaum refined it with a discipline that foreshadowed modern, organized crime. She kept meticulous records, account books that detailed every transaction, every buyer, every thief she employed. She never touched the stolen goods herself during the initial transaction. Intermediaries handled the physical transfer. She paid well and paid promptly, which built loyalty among the criminal class. And most importantly, she invested her profits back into the operation, expanding her network, increasing her capacity, and developing relationships with corrupt officials who could make problems disappear. By the 1860s, according to testimony from thieves who later turned state's evidence, Mandelbaum was no longer simply buying stolen property. She was commissioning crimes. If a wealthy family advertised their summer travel plans in the society pages, Mandelbaum would finance a burglary of their home while they were away. If a shipment of valuable goods was arriving at the docks, she would pay dock workers to misplace crates that would then be moved to her warehouse. She operated what modern law enforcement would call a theft-to-order service. Clients would request specific items, a particular brand of watch, a specific type of fabric, stolen bonds from a specific bank, and Mandelbaum would contract thieves to acquire them. Police estimates from the 1870s suggested that 70 to 80% of all stolen property moving through New York City passed through Fredericka Mandelbaum's operation at some point. She had become, in the truest sense, a crime boss. For the legitimate merchants of New York, the jewelers along Maiden Lane, the silk importers near the South Street seaport, the banks clustered around Wall Street, the 1860s and 1870s represented an age of optimistic expansion. The Civil War had ended. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. Immigration was fueling unprecedented economic growth. They believed, as business people have always believed, that hard work and honest enterprise would be rewarded. They invested in inventory. They extended credit. They trusted that the city's growing police force would protect their investments. They could not imagine that their losses, the mysteriously disappearing shipments, the burglaries that seemed too well timed to be coincidence, the stolen goods that vanished without trace, were not random acts of criminal opportunism, but carefully orchestrated operations directed by a single woman from a modest building on Clinton Street. The thieves who worked for Mandelbaum lived in a different reality. These were not the romanticized gentleman burglars of dime novels. They were desperately poor immigrants, many of them children, scraping by in the 5 Point slums and the tenements of the Lower East Side. Crime was not a choice. It was an economic strategy. And Mandelbaum represented something they'd never had before: stability. She paid fair prices. She never cheated them. She provided legal representation if they were arrested. She even operated a literal school where she taught young thieves the techniques of burglary, pickpocketing, and confidence schemes. Investigators who later examined her operation found evidence that Mandelbaum had trained dozens of juvenile criminals, some as young as 10 years old, in what she called her finishing school for thieves. For these children, Mandelbaum was not a villain. She was a benefactor, perhaps the only adult in their lives who treated them as valuable. The moral complexity of that relationship, a woman who exploited child criminals while simultaneously offering them the closest thing to economic security they would ever know, is one of the most unsettling aspects of her legacy. What neither group understood, not the legitimate merchants, not the thieves, not even the police, was that Mandelbaum's operation represented something fundamentally new in criminal history. Crime had always existed, but it had been disorganized, opportunistic, individual. Mandelbaum industrialized it. She created supply chains. She developed market efficiencies. She understood risk management, capital investment, and political corruption in ways that would not be systematically studied by law enforcement for another 50 years. The people who lost property to her operation believed they were victims of bad luck. The thieves who worked for her believed they were simply surviving. The truth was far more calculated. They were all participants in an economic system that Mandelbaum had engineered, and that system was generating profits that rivaled some of the city's legitimate corporations. The evidence that eventually exposed Fredericka Mandelbaum's empire came not from brilliant detective work, but from bureaucratic persistence and a single incorruptible prosecutor. His name was Peter B. Olney, and he was appointed as a special agent of the district attorney's office in 1883 with a specific mandate: investigate organized theft rings operating in Manhattan. Olney was not a policeman. He was an accountant and attorney, and he approached the Mandelbaum investigation as a financial audit rather than a criminal case. He understood that Mandelbaum's operation had to generate paper trails, receipts, account books, shipping records, bank deposits. His investigation focused on finding those documents. Working with a small team of detectives who were considered too new to be corrupted, Olney began tracking stolen property through the city's second-hand markets. When they found stolen goods, they traced them backward to their sellers. When they identified sellers, they offered immunity in exchange for testimony. Slowly, they built a network diagram of Mandelbaum's operation. They identified her primary buyers: a furniture dealer in Philadelphia, a jewelry merchant in Boston, a dry goods wholesaler in Montreal. They identified her regular thieves: men like Mark Shinburn, a notorious bank burglar who had worked exclusively for Mandelbaum for over a decade, and Traveling Mike Grady, a confidence man who specialized in robbing wealthy hotel guests. They identified her corrupt police contacts: officers who received monthly payments to warn her of planned raids or to lose evidence in cases involving her associates. By early 1884, Olney had assembled enough evidence to request search warrants. On July 23, 1884, investigators raided 79 Clinton Street and 4 other properties connected to Mandelbaum's operation. What they found exceeded even Olney's expectations. The Clinton Street building contained 3 floors of stolen property: silk valued at over $50,000, jewelry worth $30,000, bonds and securities totaling $200,000, and stolen goods that filled 16 police wagons. They found Mandelbaum's account books, which detailed transactions going back 15 years. They found correspondence with buyers in 8 different cities. They found a classroom-style space in the basement with lock-picking tools and practice safes, physical evidence of her school for thieves. Most damningly, they found a ledger that listed monthly payments to 12 New York City police officers, complete with badge numbers and the specific services they provided in exchange for their bribes. The legal documents from Mandelbaum's indictment, preserved in the New York County District Attorney's records, charged her with multiple counts of grand larceny and receiving stolen property. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had physical evidence. They had documentary evidence. They had multiple thieves willing to testify against her. But they made a critical mistake. They set bail at $21,000, assuming that even someone as wealthy as Mandelbaum wouldn't have that much liquid capital. They were wrong. Mandelbaum posted bail within hours. The trial was scheduled for September 1884, and the prosecution was confident they would finally bring down the queen of New York's underworld. They never got the chance. On August 17th, 3 weeks before her trial was set to begin, Fredericka Mandelbaum disappeared. Investigators later pieced together her escape route. She traveled by carriage to Brooklyn, took a train to Canada using a false identity, then sailed from Montreal to Europe. She settled in Hamilton, Ontario, just across the border, where extradition laws did not apply to her charges. She lived there for the remaining 5 years of her life, operating a small hotel and apparently conducting a reduced version of her fencing operation for Canadian criminals. She died in 1889, never having faced trial, never having served a day in prison. The woman who had stolen millions and corrupted an entire city's law enforcement system lived out her final years in comfortable exile, a middle-aged hotel owner indistinguishable from thousands of other German immigrants who had found modest success in the New World. The investigation into Fredericka Mandelbaum's operation revealed several critical turning points that changed how law enforcement understood organized crime. The first came when Peter Olney realized that traditional police methods, surveillance, informants, raids, were ineffective against someone who had spent decades building relationships with corrupt officers. Mandelbaum always knew when raids were coming. She always knew which detectives were investigating her. Olney's decision to operate outside the traditional police structure, using investigators who had no prior contact with the department, was unprecedented. It was the first time American law enforcement had created what we would now call an internal affairs approach to investigating police corruption, alongside criminal activity. The second turning point came during the analysis of Mandelbaum's account books. Olney's team discovered that she operated with the financial sophistication of a modern corporation. She depreciated the value of stolen goods over time to account for market risk. She maintained separate accounting for different product categories: jewelry, fabric, bonds, each with different profit margins and different buyer networks. She calculated the cost of bribes as a standard business expense, typically running between 8 and 12% of her gross revenue. She even maintained what appeared to be a reserve fund for legal expenses and compensation to thieves' families if they were imprisoned. This level of organization forced investigators to recognize that they were not dealing with a common criminal, but with someone who had created an alternative economy that operated parallel to the legitimate market. Among the thousands of items recovered from Fredericka Mandelbaum's warehouses, one object appeared repeatedly in investigators' reports: skeleton keys. Not just a few, but hundreds of them, organized by type, by manufacturer, by the locks they were designed to defeat. They hung on pegboards in her basement, arranged with the precision of tools in a craftsman's workshop. Each key was labeled with a small paper tag indicating which buildings or safes it could open. Some were generic keys purchased from corrupt locksmiths. Others were custom-made from wax impressions that her burglars had created during reconnaissance visits to targeted locations. A few were originals that had been stolen from building superintendents or security offices. Those skeleton keys became the symbolic representation of Mandelbaum's operation in newspaper coverage of the case. Editorial cartoons showed her as a medieval dungeon keeper, surrounded by keys, each one unlocking someone's home, someone's business, someone's life savings. But the symbolism ran deeper than journalists understood. The keys represented something fundamental about Mandelbaum's criminal genius. She understood that access was everything. Access to property, access to information, access to power. While other criminals used force, breaking windows, smashing safes, threatening victims, Mandelbaum's thieves simply walked through doors as if they belonged there. The keys were proof that her operation didn't operate outside the law. It operated through the law, using its gaps and weaknesses like a lockpick sliding into tumblers. The Mandelbaum case transformed American law enforcement in ways that wouldn't be fully recognized for decades. At the most immediate level, it forced police departments to acknowledge that corruption wasn't an individual failing, but a systemic vulnerability. The revelation that a single criminal had maintained 12 police officers on regular salary for years led to the first serious attempts at internal monitoring within the NYPD. By the 1890s, the department had established a dedicated unit responsible for investigating corruption allegations, a direct result of lessons learned from Mandelbaum's operation. This represented a fundamental shift. Police departments could no longer claim that bad officers were isolated anomalies. The Mandelbaum ledgers proved that corruption could be purchased, managed, and maintained as a business expense. The case also changed how prosecutors approached organized crime. Peter Olney's methods, following financial records, building conspiracy cases based on business relationships rather than individual crimes, using immunity agreements to turn low-level criminals into witnesses, became the template for federal racketeering prosecutions 50 years later. When the RICO Act was crafted in the 1970s to combat mafia organizations, its architects studied historical cases of organized crime prosecution. The Mandelbaum investigation was cited in congressional testimony as an early example of how to dismantle criminal enterprises by attacking their financial infrastructure rather than simply arresting individual criminals. On a cold morning in February 1889, 4.5 years after she vanished from New York, Fredericka Mandelbaum died in Hamilton, Ontario. She was 63 years old. The death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. She was buried in a small Jewish cemetery outside Toronto, her grave marked with a simple headstone that identified her as Fredericka Mandelbaum, devoted wife and mother. There was no mention of her empire, no acknowledgement of the thousands of crimes she had orchestrated, no recognition that she had built and commanded one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in American history. But her influence did not die with her. In the decades that followed, as organized crime evolved from scattered street gangs into highly structured organizations, Mandelbaum's methods were studied, refined, and replicated. The Prohibition-era gangsters who built criminal empires on bootlegging used her model of corrupting officials, maintaining financial records, and treating crime as a business. The mafia families that dominated American organized crime through the mid-20th century operated with the same principles she had established: centralized authority, specialized roles, systematic violence only when necessary, and above all, the understanding that crime's greatest weapon was not force, but access. Her story forces a confronting question. What does it mean when the criminal mind proves more innovative than the legal institutions designed to contain it? Mandelbaum operated for 25 years in plain sight, in a city with a police force, a district attorney's office, and thousands of legitimate business owners who believed they were protected by the rule of law. She succeeded not because law enforcement was absent, but because she understood its limitations better than the people enforcing it. She recognized that laws are not walls, but procedures, and procedures can be navigated by anyone sufficiently patient and resourceful. The skeleton keys still hanging in that evidence warehouse are not just relics of a single criminal's tools. They are symbols of a permanent truth about security. It is always a negotiation between those who build walls and those who learn to walk through them. Fredericka Mandelbaum built her fortune on that negotiation, and she won. She died free, wealthy, and unpunished. Her name a footnote in histories that prefer to focus on criminals who fit more dramatic narratives. But the investigators who studied her operation, the prosecutors who built cases based on her methods, and the criminals who learned from her example all understood something the general public never quite grasped. The most dangerous criminals are not the ones who break through the door. They're the ones who hold the key. On Clinton Street today, the building where Mandelbaum operated has long since been demolished and replaced by modern housing. There is no plaque, no historical marker, no indication that one of the most consequential criminal enterprises in American history was directed from that exact location. The city has forgotten her, as cities always forget the people who exploit their vulnerabilities. But the systems she created, the networks of corruption, the professionalization of theft, the understanding that crime could be industrialized, those systems persist. They evolved into the organized crime structures that law enforcement continues to fight, using tools and concepts that Mandelbaum's case helped create. The moral of Fredericka Mandelbaum's story is both simple and profound. Evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed as legitimate business, speaking the language of commerce, building systems that look almost respectable from the outside. The most dangerous threats to society are not always the ones who break the rules loudly. They're the ones who rewrite them silently. Mandelbaum showed us that corruption is not an aberration, but a market force, that crime can be industrialized just like any other enterprise, and that the distance between legitimate business and criminal empire can be measured in nothing more than intent and opportunity. Her legacy reminds us that vigilance must be constant, that systems require oversight, and that the moment we assume our institutions are incorruptible is the moment they become most vulnerable. She changed forever how criminals operate and how we try to stop them, and neither side has ever been the same. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden history of organized crime in America, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime history. Drop a comment below and let me know. What shocked you most about Fredericka Mandelbaum's operation? Was it her school for thieves, her corruption of police officers, or the fact that she escaped justice completely? Your thoughts help shape future content, so don't hold back. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another investigation into the criminals who changed history. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most dangerous stories are the ones history tried to forget.